ACNFers, this show, as you know, it takes a lot of time, and part of what helps keep the lights on overhead is if you consider hiring me to edit or coach up your work. A generous editor helps you see what you can't see. It could be a pitch, a proposal, an essay, hell, even a book. If you need help cracking the code, I know I need help cracking the code. Email me at creativenonfictionpodcast@gmail.com, and we will start a dialogue.
The storytelling and the creative process is messy, and I kind of envision it like if you're climbing a mountain and you're roped up with like a rope team climbing a glacier for safety, like your rope team there's individual people on that line, but everyone has to work together to like make it to the summit.
Oh my God, does talking ever make you want to yawn? And now I've got that feeling in the middle of my chest where I can't get the yawn out. Hold on a second. Oh man, I think I did it. Okay, hey. It's your CNF and spin instructor, Brendan O'Mara, and this is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, the show where I speak to groovy he-hims, she-hers, and they-thems about telling true stories. Right off the top, you know I like to read reviews when they come in. We haven't had one in a while, but we got a new one. Brand new one. And here's a curveball. 3 stars. The very first 3-star written review. Let's go. From Please Talk Better. Yucky intros. The host sounds like a cheesy shock jock high energy D-bag. I have noticed that this is mainly in the show intros, so if I like the featured person, I will give it a try. Thank you very much. Please Talk Better. High energy D-bag. I'm a very low energy D-bag. Glad you're aboard, friend. As I tell many people, I'm an acquired taste. I might grow on you. And you know what? I'm pretty stoked about this review, man. I owe you a coaching session of up to 2,000 words, and that goes for anyone who leaves a written review and sends me a screenshot of it. So just email me at creativenonfictionpodcast@gmail.com. Please talk better. And we'll start a dialogue, friend. This review illustrates a point I want to make, and I'll do that in the parting shot, okay? If I had fart sounds, I could really lean into the shock jockiness of it all. Moving on. We have Cole Heilborn on the show today, CNFers. Cole is the founder of Portside Productions, a marketing film company focusing largely on the outdoors and storytelling centering on the outdoors. He teamed up with my pals at Athletic Brewing to produce an incredible documentary called Inches to Miles, and it's on YouTube. Links will be in the show notes. And this spotlights 3 Athletic Brewing ambassadors and their incredible stories as they train up to and compete in the Lake Placid Ironman triathlon. The LP Ironman takes place this weekend, weekend of July 19th, 20th, right in there. So the timing is apropos. And sidebar, back in 2003, when I was 23, had just turned 23, I competed, if you can call it that, in the Lake Placid Ironman with my best friend Pete. Our goal was to do the race without training, which we by and large did. We worked at a restaurant over the summers there, the Downhill Grill, where the race organizers often drank after a long day, and many of us had a distaste in our mouths from triathletes. Not from, you know what I mean, not from like tasting triathletes, just that distaste that you just don't like them and their self-importance for, this extreme endurance thing. And there was a pridefulness and a boastfulness that was always off-putting. It was not uncommon for people to coming up to train in Lake Placid on the bike course or something, and they'd go into a store and pull out sweaty dollar bills from under their bike shorts to pay for a Gatorade, or if they came in the restaurant smelling like shit and handing you just gross, wet currency. Many of the athletes, to borrow a term from our 3-star reviewer, were total D-bags. So Pete and I sought to do this race without training to, stick it to them. What assholes. All dudes in their low to mid-20s are assholes, and I was no different. Anyway, I couldn't swim 50 yards when I registered, so I had to work on that. But for the most part, I didn't do any specific training, nor did Pete, who's kind of a natural swimmer. We finished together in about 15 hours, 50 minutes. It might have been 15:51 and change. We're right around there. It doesn't matter. But it was murder, man. And I remember writing in my journal at the time, despite how we were trying to stick it to them, I wrote in my journal that I had never been happier than when I finished. It's a special feeling crossing that finish line, as you're nearing midnight, and the celebration of crossing that finish line, the finishing party, as they call it. And it's a really warm, electric feeling in a great way, as we've been on your feet for so long. And it's a special feeling. I had a newfound respect for it. Anyway, the people at the heart of Inches to Miles are really inspiring, wonderful people, certainly better than I was when I was 23. It centers on Lynn Rogers, Timmy Howard, and Shannon Greenfield. And it really is a spectacular film that charts the many types of journeys to reach the starting line at Lake Placid and, one hopes, the finish line of one of the more grueling endurance races on the planet. A 2.4-mile swim in open water on Mirror Lake, a 112-mile bike ride, 2 56-mile loops. That's the killer at the Lake Placid thing. It's like you go 56 miles and you're cooked and it's hard. And you're like, I could go another loop, and then a 26.2-mile run. No big deal. And that's like an out and back kind of thing. And it's that's grueling unto itself, just the repetition of it all. I can still feel my Achilles tendons just not wanting to Achilles tendon, if that makes any sense. This film really brought me back to my time in Lake Placid. Some of the happiest summers I ever experienced. And one summer, 2002, being maybe the greatest of all. But that's not germane to our conversation here. I just felt like saying that. Show notes and the parting shot to this episode and more are at BrendanO'Mara.com, where you can also sign up for the Companion Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. Each podcast gets a cute little newsletter since I'm not really on social media anymore. There's a too long didn't listen mini transcript, some behind the scenes bullshit about my rotten head, my even more rotten writing, especially with respect to this Prefontaine biography that I'm trying to finish. And there's also the first of the month Rager with cool links, book recommendations, a list of 11 things. It literally goes up to 11. And just one other item, there's also patreon.com/CNFpod if you want to help support the show with a couple bucks. And I want to welcome Paul Engman to the crew, new patron. Thank you so much for throwing a few bucks in the CNF and collection plate. Those dollars go into making the show better, be it better equipment, or paying out writers for the audio magazine, which I hope to revive once I put my book to bed. Awesome stuff. Thank you, Paul. So in this conversation with Cole, we talk about the mechanics of documentary nonfiction storytelling, how you can't be quite as nimble as you can with, say, what I do, just a notebook or an easy phone call or something. Balancing storytelling with what a brand wants. And in this case, how Athletic Brewing wasn't an intrusive brand in this film. It's subtle and pretty cool that they insisted on forefronting the story, not their product. And I think the most important lesson of all that Cole brings up, how he got his start and how you want to get your start in anything when you just don't know how to get that toe hold. If you want to do a certain kind of work, you just need to do it. And then you build a body of work, and that body of work gets better. And then you can show that to people. And then maybe from there, you can make a happy buck. So I know this is kind of a long intro. Lake Placid did that to me, man. So that's where we're at, CNFers. Are you ready for Cole Heilborn? Riff.
How did I get into film? I feel like everyone kind of asks themselves that question. You're like, how did I end up here? And it's a very meandering path. For me, I feel like I've always loved like creating stuff. Like as a kid, I was always, the guy on the block who was like building go-karts or tree houses or, I like a video camera or a set of tools. Like it didn't really matter what my tool was. Like I just loved making things. And so I've always really enjoyed the creativity of trying to build something. In high school is kind of when I first found the camera, and a friend of mine had a camera, and I still am into mountain biking, but we were really into mountain biking at the time, and we just started shooting like mountain bike videos up on our local bike hill, and
Mm.
they were like as bad as you can guess. And it was like the dad cam with like dubstep music put to it, and it was a ton of fun. I feel like those first few videos like really kind of opened my eyes. It's like what you could do with a camera, and slowly but surely, I just started making more and more videos, and I, eventually started a YouTube channel like every kid in high school does, and started just cranking out like funny, goofy kind of skits and sketches, and like really VFX heavy work. Heavy. I say that like I was a VFX artist. Like it was pretty basic stuff, but it was a ton of fun, and like that's really kind of what ignited this fire of like telling stories and being creative through the video medium. And so went to college, studied film and video, had no idea what the heck I was going to do to like actually make a living doing that. Came back, moved back to home, and just kind of stumbled into like the corporate commercial side of video production. I didn't really know that existed, but I found a job on Craigslist offering me $100 to go shoot an event at the local hotel convention center, and I was like, "Dang! Like this is." I just made money. I made $100 for 2 hours with my camera. Like this is awesome. And
Nice.
yeah, I think like after that gig, I filed for my sole prop and was like, well, I'm just gonna try to like find work and start my own business and see where it takes me. And that was 8 or 9 years ago. And today I run a production company called Portside Productions. We work in the outdoor and kind of outdoor adjacent industries, and we help our clients. We work with direct to brands and with agencies, and we help them tell stories, make documentaries, be that feature length or kind of the short film length, and then we also do commercial work. So we help folks develop creative and then execute on that. So that's 15, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, that type of stuff. So I'm a producer and a director these days.
When you were trying to get momentum and everything, what can you point to, after you made that, that first $100 for a couple hours of work? Like, what can you point to as something that was an early win that helped put wind in your sails to get start building more of that body of work?
Oh man, I don't know that there's like a singular thing. I feel like, I mean, I've spent the last 9 years like trying to figure out like what's my place, like who are we as a company, like what do we do, what's the type of work we want to do, how does that work provide value to potential clients who are our clients. Like I've asked myself thousands of questions and only answered a few of them. I feel like if I had to like choose a couple kind of singular points along the way, somewhere along the way someone told me, or I realized, like if you want to get paid to create the type of work you want to make, you have to make that work first and show it on your portfolio. And so at the time for us, that meant just like going out and creating spec work. At the time in the business, like we were really only getting paid to shoot weddings, do real estate videos, and those things are great. And I think many budding videographers and filmmakers can relate. Like that's how we often all get started, is like those kind of more basic gigs. I say basic, like wedding cinematography is definitely a hard job, but
Yeah.
it wasn't for me. I was like, I want to make something that's like outside. I want there to be a story. I want there to be action and movement and energy. And so that meant just like really trying to take the initiative and like go out and create spec work, finding interesting stories and just shooting them. And then slowly, as I'd like build spec work, I'd share that with my connections, and slowly like that would lead to paid work, and you do more of that paid work, and then you have more to put on your portfolio, and it's just kind of a snowball that goes and goes and goes. So I think that was one kind of piece to it. Another element was like finding work can be a challenging problem that I think a lot of filmmakers experience also, especially as you're getting started. Is like, how do you build connections to the right people who want to work on these types of projects? And I kind of stumbled across this. I started a podcast called the Backcountry Marketing Podcast, and I interview leaders in the outdoor marketing industry about the lessons they're learning. It's meant to be an educational show about the landscape of marketing. And I started that kind of as like an adjacent to the production company. And I didn't realize that at the time. We've done 170 episodes now on that show. I didn't realize it at the time, but that podcast has become one of the main ways we find work these days. It's one of the
Mm.
main ways we build relationships with potential clients. And not every guest who comes on the show turns into a client by any means, but it's been such a great way to meet people, build relationships, and sometimes those turn into projects, turn into client relationships. So if I had to pick like two things, I'd say build your body of work to reflect the type of work you want to get hired to do, and then figure out how to build relationships with potential clients. And maybe that's not a podcast, but like do that however you see fit, whatever works for you.
Right. I love the agency that you have to do. You know, if you want to make narrative podcasts or something, and you're like, how do I get my start? It's like, well, go out and just do that thing. Go find a nonprofit who might need some storytelling. Be like, you know what? I'm going to volunteer this for you. You know, you'll get your story out there. I'll get some work that I can show other people. And I think a lot of people who are struggling to figure out, like, well, how do you get into it? What you get into it, it's as it's simple but not easy. It's just like by just doing it.
Yeah.
And it's hard for people to get their heads around sometimes. It's like, oh, I just go out and do it. Like Seth Godin will say, like, you want to be in marketing, like go do marketing. Go find someone and do some work for them. And then it's a body of work. And when you run into the gatekeepers, they don't care where you went to school. They just want you. They just want to know that you can pull it off, and you can only do that by showing them actual work.
Right. Yeah, totally. It's tough though, because like you got to make money and survive while
Yeah.
you're trying to do that. And so it's a tricky spot to be in. But I think if you can figure out how to structure your life, and I don't know, try to keep your expenses as low as possible just to like pursue the thing you want to pursue. I mean, that was kind of my approach, and it still is my approach.
Yeah. And what were some of the day jobs that you had to kind of subsidize the work you wanted to do before that work eventually subsumed? Yeah, it became,
Yeah, so I
your
worked part
work.
time. So I filed my sole prop after that $100 gig, got my business license. I was like, all right, I'm ready to go. And then it was like crickets. And I was like, oh, okay, this is a little harder than maybe I thought. So I started work. I did a bunch of odd stuff. I had a part time job for about a year and a half. I worked at a warehouse shipping out cat furniture and pet supplies. And so I would show up to this warehouse, I don't know, like 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. I would, get my list of tasks for the day, and package up a bunch of cat furniture and load it on a pallet to be picked up later that day by FedEx. And I
Mhm.
would try to be out of there by 10 a.m. or 12 p.m., hustle back to the house, and then just spend the rest of the day working on video stuff. And so I did that for about a year and a half. And I remember putting in my 2 weeks for that job. I think I had a couple $1,000s in the bank, and I had like 3 months of work lined up. And I was like, okay, if there's ever a time I can quit, like I think it's now. Like this is the most runway I've ever had. And I was like, worst case scenario, I could always just come back to this job. And so I put in my 2 weeks, and I was
Mhm.
like, all right, here we go. And yeah, I haven't looked back.
Oh, that's great. And when it comes to doing the work itself, where do you find yourself most excited and engaged? Be it, behind the camera filming or with your computer and editing. Where do you like prefer to be? Where do you really lock in?
I think that's changed over the years as the business has grown, and I've been, reevaluating my role in the business. I'm not so much technical these days. There was a time when I was hands on the camera and I was hands on the keyboard, but I mostly take on a producing and a directing role these days. So I'm usually hiring a crew to help me with the project we're working on. What I really enjoy these days is I enjoy the business side of it. Like I enjoy the challenge of like trying to run the business and find work and build those relationships and solve those business problems as much as I love the creativity and the storytelling and the work that goes into actually making the product. So those are the two things that I love. On the creative side, like I love getting to sit down with the client and try to understand like what are we making, why are we making it, what do we want this to look and feel like, what's the goal, and then taking all of those answers and then trying to find a story in which to communicate all of those ideas. And I enjoy kind of that communication between the client side and then the creative side. And then I really just enjoy the process of like of finding the stories. Like I get stoked telling the stories, being out in the field, capturing gorgeous moments like, at golden hour, or, if there's like, we have a cable camp set up and like mountain bikers are ripping down a trail. Like, I love that type of energy on set, and like finding those really special moments, be that interviews or like, epic imagery or landscape shots. Like, I don't know, there's a number of elements I love throughout the process.
Yeah, what are some of the questions when you're meeting with a client, or just the people you're looking to tell stories for, that what are some of the questions that they get hung up on as you're looking to flesh out, the narrative of, and get to the heart of it?
I think a big one is like, what story are we telling? Because I guess, to back up, like, a lot of the stories that we tell are kind of in that brand storytelling vein, and that's how it fits into their marketing department. And I think there's so many stories out there, and a brand often has hundreds or thousands of pitches, to tell interesting stories. And it's like, how do you find a really what is a good one? And good is obviously arbitrary, but what is good for this use case, or what is good for this
Yeah,
particular
you can
this
keep going.
particular situation? And so, I think one question is like, what is a good, what is the right story to tell? Who's the right character? What is the right subject? What is the right environment? What's the right location for all of this to happen? And I feel like a lot of those questions can be answered if you really understand kind of the marketing goals behind the project. Because again, like, that's the angle that we do a lot of our work in, is from the marketing side. We're less narrative, and so I think a lot of those questions like can be answered through understanding the client's goals. And I just enjoy the process of taking those goals and then trying to find a story that like accomplishes all of those things. I think about it. I guess I think about their goals in terms of like storytelling language and characters and
Hmm.
and environments and all those kind of nitty gritty details that storytellers like to geek out on.
For sure. Yeah, and I come from like a journalism side of things, and not so much a brand thing, though I've done some brand writing before, and it's like it kind of uses the same skill set, but at the same, in journalism, you're not like acquiescing to what the sources want. Ultimately you're making all those decisions, and they don't get that editorial say. But when you're working with brands, of course, it's like, all right, you want to still be creative and tell those stories, but ultimately, like, they have final say. And so, how do you? Not that you come at it from a journalistic background, but how do you navigate, the dialogue that you need to have with them? So you're telling something that excites you, but it's also in service of what they want to do.
Yeah, I think it's just through like setting up a good foundation, a good working relationship. My analogy that I kind of always preface new clients or new projects with is like, the storytelling and the creative process is messy, and I kind of
Hmm.
envision it like if you're climbing a mountain and you're roped up with like a rope team climbing a glacier for safety. Like, your rope team is, there's individual people on that line, but everyone has to work together to like make it to the summit. And some people might think you go this way or this way, some people might be slower or faster, but we all have to communicate, we all have to work together, and we all have our unique skill sets on this team. And so, I don't view the client, like our relationship to the clients, as adversarial. I don't feel like it's a us
Hmm.
versus them, like in terms of like, quote unquote, winning, the whatever the creative discussion is. I think if we set up a good foundation and we can have candid conversations, like that friction, there's inevitably friction. I don't think that's bad. I think you just kind of have to work through it and just talk through it, and just know, like, okay, remember, like, this is what they're trying to accomplish, this is what we're trying to accomplish, and somewhere like we're going to find a place in the middle where it works for everyone and it honors the story, but it also, accomplishes whatever the client goals are through it. So yeah, I don't know, just good communication.
As somewhat of a transitionary punch in right here, we're going to start talking a little bit about Inches to Miles, the wonderful hour-long documentary that Cole and his company produced in conjunction with Athletic Brewing, who I'm a brand ambassador for. Not that I get any money or anything of that nature, but I love their non-alcoholic beer. I do. So we're going to talk about that film. It's a brilliant film, and we're going to talk about it. Okay. And what was it about, let's say, Lynn Rogers, Timmy Howard, and Channing, what's his name? Channing Greenfield? Like, what was it about the three of them that spoke to you to tell this story of of building up to Lake Placid Iron Man?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the film we had three characters. They were all really incredible people, and I think one of the goals from the beginning with this film was like we wanted to tell stories that were inspiring. We wanted to tell stories that someone could listen to or watch and be like, wow, like this is really motivating. This is really impressive. Like one of athletics, kind of brand values is like without compromise, like the pursuit of progress. And so we wanted to find stories that kind of embodied that spirit, but we also wanted to do so in a way that represented just a variety of audience members who might find themselves watching. And so, the goal was to pick three different people with different stories in the hopes that, as the watcher, you could relate and connect with at least one of them and find empathy for them on their quest. And so, Lynn, I'll kind of give a brief summary of like each of their stories. So Lynn
Yeah.
is an amazing woman. She's out of Chicago. To summarize her story, she is an athlete. She's an Ironman. She's done an Ironman before. Has a PhD. She's a doctor studying the brain, and through a crazy turn of events, she's training for an Ironman. She gets bit by a dog, and something like 10 days later, at the start line of an Ironman, the one she's been training for, she ends up paralyzed. And it's this wild journey, this wild turn of events where she's, literally the best shape of her life. And then 10 days later, she can't walk. And she's like, what the heck happened to me? And so she has then had this ongoing battle with this chronic disease called CIDP. And she's been trying to regain the ability. She's regained the ability to walk and to run and to cycle. But she wants to get back to that Ironman start line and give it another go and try to tackle it, with this new disease. And so when she was telling us her story, we're like, oh my gosh, like this is amazing, incredible, like all the feelings. And so we were like, this is one of those stories that like you read about or you watch about, you're like, wow. And I think that's all we could say. It was just like, wow, like how could we not include this story? So Timmy, to give a brief summary on him, he currently lives in Indiana. Grew up kind of a rough childhood. Ended up getting addicted to alcohol, drugs. Ultimately, that led to heroin and being on the streets for I don't know something like 6 years. Crazy set of life experiences on the streets. Ultimately,
Yeah.
though, kind of hit rock bottom and was like, I can't live this life anymore. I need to turn it around. And so the way he turned his life around was accidentally kind of finding running and the community around running and athletics. And he's slowly been kind of building his life back. Got married, and now athletics is like this incredible community that helps him stay sober. It provides him the support that he needs. And an Ironman for him was kind of this way of saying like, I'm not who I was. I want to try something that's difficult, and I want to prove to myself that I can do it because I've what I've been through. So again, his story was like one of those wow stories. You're just like, oh my gosh, I can't believe like this guy's been through more in his life than 10 people will be through in their lives. Shannon's story, I think, was a very relatable story. He grew up in New York, a fairly privileged kind of, basic upbringing. And he really didn't take life very seriously. He didn't really try very hard. He ended up getting kicked out of college. Somewhere along the way, he was like, I really need to kind of take life seriously, take responsibility for my actions and discipline and focus myself. And so he kind of did so through athletics. And similar to the other two, he's like, I want to do an Ironman because I want to prove to myself that I'm responsible, like I'm disciplined, like I'm no longer the person who I was. I'm no longer the college, dropout. Like I can do this. And so for each of them, they each had their own very strong reason for why they wanted to accomplish this Ironman. And I think that's kind of how we picked them all. Was like we wanted to find some really wow stories. We wanted to balance those with different geography. We wanted to find stories that were relatable. And so we interviewed 12 members of Team Athletic, and we ended up choosing those three based on some of those parameters.
Yeah, and given that you shoot, so much footage, let's just say for interviews alone, and then getting whatever, B-roll you need of them working out and stuff of that nature, and you've got an hour of tape, of a movie. And so what becomes the challenge of like balancing the three of them so one doesn't dominate the other three, or two don't dominate the other one?
Yeah, that's a real challenge. I mean, I think our interview with Lynn was like 7 hours.
Wow.
Timmy was
Yeah.
like 5, Shannon was like 4 or 5, and so
Oh
there's
yeah.
obviously a lot that did not make the cut. And I mean, post production was 6 or 9 months, 6 or 8 months. And I think every day we showed up to the edit, we were like, okay, like, what do we cut? Because there is a lot. And I think we wanted to structure the film in a way that felt like we were all moving forwards towards Lake Placid. Like Lake Placid was kind of like this looming challenge that was hanging over all of their heads. And as we were progressing towards that, we started to understand more of their backstory, so that Lake Placid then became not only a physical challenge, but it became a challenge that really kind of tested their spirits and the things that they've been through. We played a lot around with the structure. We did all that mostly through paper cuts, moving scenes around on a Google Doc, and then translating that
Hmm.
to the timeline. But we tried to find a way to kind of scatter them throughout. So we're jumping in between each of their stories in a way that felt fluid and in a way that felt like we were progressing. So we kind of structured them so that we were all building together. We also didn't want this film to like, because some of the backstory for some of these characters is pretty difficult and heavy stuff. And so we also didn't want this film to feel like a total downer for like the first 30 minutes. And so we
Hmm.
tried to also consider, how do we structure each of their stories? So maybe while, Lynn is becoming paralyzed, like maybe Timmy is like, there's a more positive beat for something happening in his storyline. And so we try to structure them in a way like that, where it wasn't like back to back to back, like broken, difficult stuff. Um,
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. And are you, when you're kind of storyboarding that out and looking at the structure, do you color code each thing so you can have a visual reference of, oh, this looks a little blue here. It needs to have some red in there to kind of balance out things of that
Yeah,
nature?
so our first step was to develop a beat sheet. So we got like one of those trifold boards, and gave a
Hmm.
scene, posted note for each character, and kind of mapped out all of their scenes. And so it was like blue, green, and pink, I think, were the colors. And so that was like our first step to see, what are all these scenes and beats look like in order. And we rearranged a lot with that initial beat sheet, and before we started actual production. And then once we wrapped and we started looking at all of our footage, we rearranged that beat sheet again. And then we eventually moved to the script, where we actually then were moving transcripts and moving lines and dialogue and all of that. But yeah, I think that was definitely one of the techniques we used. But I also think too, like beyond just like total screen time that maybe someone has, there's also, you have to like consider the emotional toll, or like the emotional experience, I feel like, with each of them. And so that was an element too. So like on paper, sometimes it would look like, oh, Shannon has way more screen time, but we're trying to like balance that with maybe a shorter amount of screen time from Lynn, because like her story is like super heavy. So maybe we need to like give more screen time to someone else to like try to balance it out. So it wasn't like a one for one kind of breakdown of time. We were really also trying to think about it in terms of like the emotional experience too.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I love hearing the mechanics of that, and it's not just like you said, it's not just a minute. You're not trying to just balance time. You're trying to balance
Right.
emotion.
Yeah.
What I imagine is a huge challenge in documentary film versus say what I do, which is more just like narrative writing, narrative journalism, is like if there's a moment, let's say in the race, and I'm like, you know what, this feels a little thin. Let me go back to the principal people and like re-interview them. Let's try to get some more get some more details so I can like flesh out a scene. With you, it's like you are at the mercy of what you're able to film, and maybe you can backfill it with some of that narration on their part. But that said, it's like if you don't get it in camera, you can't go get it again. So how do you account for that?
Yeah, so there's a number of ways that I feel like projects can be structured, mostly that are dependent upon like timeline and budget. Because like some documentaries, you can go back for 3 or 4 interviews, right, and do pickups and fill in the gaps. And yeah, this film was like kind of, half of it was like retelling of stories that had happened in the past, and then the other last third of the film was going to Lake Placid and seeing the race happen. And so we were kind of blending production. It was like real time capture, and then we were kind of taking more of a narrative approach to like retell the things that had happened in the past. And so it took a lot of planning, honestly. So we only did
Yeah.
so we I think had 10 days of production. No, that doesn't sound right. Maybe 12 days of production. And so we spent a few days with each of the characters before the race, and then we spent a few days with all of them at the race. And so we spent a lot of time, well, those few days before the race with each character, we spent a lot of time just prepping. And we essentially mapped out their story on paper. So we were like, these are the beats we need to cover, these are the scenes that we need to tell this part of their story, this is the dialogue, these are the questions, this is the dialogue that we think we need to tell this part of their story. And then it just was a matter of sitting down and having an interview with each of them and just going over their story and understanding like what are the transition points in their story, and getting to the point where like we knew we needed someone to say, we never wanted the characters, we never wanted to tell them what to say, but we also
Hmm.
knew that there was a lot of jumping around in time and space with some of these stories, and we needed to try and help the audience feel like they were moving through the story in a way that made sense and was coherent. And so we there were some points where like, for instance, Lynn, we needed her to like say a transition statement. We needed her to like fast forward her life through a year and like move us from A to B in a way that made sense for the audience. And so we knew that we needed to get a statement like that from her. And so we just spent some time in the interview chair having her say something that felt very organic and natural to her, but was a transitional statement we could use in the edit that helped us move through the time. So I think we only did interviews with each of them once. We had some verite and like pickup interviews throughout, but we never went back and did more interviews because we were able to get most of everything we needed in those primary interviews. For the race, we got almost everything we needed while we were there to capture that real time stuff. And then we did include a speech that Lynn gave to an event that happened post race, and that was a way of kind of wrapping up the film, where she acknowledged how the race went for each of the athletes. So just yeah, a lot of planning. That's really what it boiled down to.
Yeah. And when you say yeah, verite, what does that mean?
Oh, kind of like fly on the wall approach. Like
Okay.
camera is following a character around, and maybe they're
Okay.
like checking in their bike, and I
Gotcha.
might prompt them. I'm like, "Hey Timmy, can you tell us what you're doing?" And then he just starts talking. Like that's kind of
Hmm.
the verite approach.
Okay. And what's also, I imagine, a big challenge, and it's probably something that you're used to, and certainly people like your main characters are kind of used to it by this point. It's if I'm shadowing someone, I'm basically just carrying a notebook around. Maybe I have a voice recorder, but it's primarily a notebook, and I can be a fly on the wall without being too intrusive. But you're probably, you've got cameras, maybe boom mics, and you're trying to follow people around, especially in very dramatic settings where someone has had a tremendous letdown, and it's just like, here's the camera, and I gotta now film you while you're breaking down and sobbing, and it's like, hey, I know it's part of your craft, but how do you develop the skill and the muscle to be able to still hold that camera there while people are in a weak moment?
Yeah, it's tricky for sure because you don't want to feel like you're exploiting them or you're taking advantage of a moment, but at the same time, you're like, wow, like we're here to document, and so we need to
Yeah.
like do our job. But how do we do it in a way that is as comfortable as possible, for the person who's in that moment? I think it starts with the rapport. I think it starts with kind of the expectations going into the project. Obviously, you can't do these types of stories without trust between the film production team and the characters, the people. I keep calling them characters; they're people.
Right. I know.
uh,
I do the same thing sometimes. Like, yeah, my characters, my story. Like, nope, but they're actual people, and they're not figments of my imagination that I brought to the page.
yeah, and so I think it starts there, and I think if you can, I think that's like the first step is you have to build that trust. I think you have to let them know from the very beginning like what your intentions are as the storyteller, and you have to figure out a way to build that bridge. And then when you find yourself, if you find yourself in one of those situations, I think you still have to be, you have to read the room. You have to figure out, is this the right time? Like maybe we should wait a minute before we start the camera. Maybe we should ask, like, are you okay if we turn the camera on? Like there's ways, I think, to kind of soften the blow before a camera just shows up in their face. But I think it starts with that understanding. And there's one moment in our film where Lynn has a breakdown, and yeah, it was rough. Like we didn't just want to shove a camera in her face when she was having this really personal and intimate moment with herself. But we also knew, like, we need to capture this. And so I think in that moment, our strategy was, okay, like let's give her as much time as we can. Let's start the camera. And I think she reluctantly knew, like, okay, I need, this is part of the deal, unfortunately. Like
Yeah.
I need to bear with these guys while they ask me a couple of questions. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's a very individualistic approach between you and the
Right.
and the person you're working with.
Yeah, and I think it comes when you set the expectations early on through your sit down interviews. You get people comfortable with the idea of the red light is on, and then they this is sort of the hot tub they're bathing in, for better or worse. And it's just like, okay, ideally I will be triumphant here, and but there, in those moments of struggle, that still needs to be documented, because this is nonfiction, this is real stuff, and that's they're at the mercy of what actually happens, and they're in it, and it's like, all right, well, yeah, this is part of it, and I agreed to be documented here. And but then on your end, it's also like, it's kind of like the medical thing of just like, do no harm, but you still need to document.
Yeah, and I think for them, like, I think getting through some of those rougher moments probably was helpful for them. I think they reminded themselves, I'm assuming. I think they knew why they wanted to make this film and be a part of it, because I think they all wanted to share their stories to inspire others. And I think, if I had to guess, like, I think that helped each of them go through some of those tougher moments where there was a camera in their face, and like they didn't want the camera there, but they were like, okay, I know that this for the greater good, like I know this will help people. Um, it also can be motivational. I think Timmy told us a story after the race where he was in the run and he was done. But every time he saw us out on the course with the camera, he's like, okay, I got to look good for the camera. I gotta start running. And so he would run past the camera, go around the corner, and then stop and then walk again. And he's like, honestly, the camera helped me get a better time on the Ironman. So,
Oh, that's hilarious.
so it could be helpful too,
Yeah, I'm like putting myself in their shoes, and they see the crew come, and they're like, "Oh fuck!"
Yeah.
Like, I gotta like put on a good face. Like, I'm not in the mood for this right now. Okay, all right, what? All right, we're in it. All right, what you got? I'll try to give you what I can.
You hit the nail on the head. There's a lot of moments like that in the outtakes of the footage.
And like, given how much has to ultimately get cut, what stuck out to me was this idea. There was this quote, the Churchill quote that Lynn uses two times, basically. Once when she, spoilers, like once when she doesn't make the bike cut off, and she can't proceed to the marathon, and then at the very end, she says it again at that conference that you were talking about, and it's just this idea of success isn't final and failure isn't fatal. And it's like, in a short film, when you have so much footage, and when you hear something of that nature come up twice, you're like, that is a kind of the soul of the movie, in a sense. And you leave it in there twice because that really has to carry a lot of weight, and it's like the meaning of it. So like, what did that line mean to you as the filmmaker behind the story?
I think it summarized, like, I mean, telling a story is like complicated, and you spend so much
Mhm.
time like trying to summarize, like, what is this story I'm telling, both for yourself, but also so you can like tell people what this movie is about. So I think it's internal and external to like try to find a way to summarize the story. And yeah, when Lynn shared that quote with us, as it's part of her, her personal kind of mantra. Like she reminds herself of that
Yeah.
every day, and it's like, oh, this is it. Like, you know, this is the movie. Like, this is the story. Success isn't final, failure isn't fatal. And so the fact that she she could summarize the whole thing for us, I think really helped us as the filmmakers. We're like, oh, this is it. Like, this is kind of the guiding light that we need to kind of aim towards. and the fact that it had so much meaning and meant so much to her too, I think just made it all that much more authentic and real. They weren't words we put in her mouth. It was just something that she's discovered for herself and believes herself. So that was a neat find. That's one of those things that you kind of discover along the way. As much as I talk
Yeah.
about planning, like there's so much you can't plan for, and that was one of those things that popped up through the process.
Yeah, it's amazing when that stuff happens when you like eat this, and that's the beauty of nonfiction too. You can tie yourself in knots and worry about like, oh my God, is enough good stuff going to happen that will make this compelling? Because I can't massage it; it's just going to be what it is. And then certain things happen that you're like you could have never seen coming, and then lo and behold, she says something like that, and you're like, oh my God, like that is it. That's what it's about right there. And she summed it up. You didn't have to coach her to say it, or you could never have seen it coming. And it's like, wow, that's the heart and soul of the movie right there.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's kind of the risk of nonfiction storytelling, documentary filmmaking is like you're just kind of taking a plunge, and
Yeah,
and you're like, we're gonna find what we find. Um, and I think there's ways you can try to set yourself up for success, certainly, but yeah, I think that's just kind of the name of the game.
for sure. And I think the name of the game also is no matter how inspiring certain people's stories can be, ultimately, and this is more true in audio and in documentary, is they need to be good talkers too. Like they need to be good storytellers themselves.
Yeah,
Lynn is especially skilled at it, and you're like, okay, not only are you inspiring, but you're able to articulate it in a way that's compelling on screen and on the ear. So like, was that a component of your auditioning of a lot of the people who I imagine have all compelling stories, but some are just really they're just better talkers than others.
absolutely. I think like that's second to their story. Like that's the next requirement.
Yeah.
For better or for worse, because I think that does alienate a lot of people who have really great stories. But if you're telling the story in the way we did, which is like we're going to sit down, we're going to do an interview, and you're going to tell us your story. There's other ways you could tell someone's story, but if that's kind of the format you're taking, yeah, then they have to be articulate. They have to be self-aware enough to describe their story. And I think that takes to get to a spot to do that. I think takes a lot of personal work. It takes a lot of knowing yourself. It takes a lot of being vulnerable, and those are tough things. And so while I think everyone has a story, I don't know that everyone can tell their story. And so that's definitely one of the things you got to look for in a documentary. Maybe as a writer, like you can kind of help fill in some of the gaps. You can tell me if that's true or not, but I think in the documentary world it's a little different. Like you need someone to tell you their story, and it's our job to kind of piece it together as best we can.
Absolutely, yeah. As a writer, you can fill in those gaps. You can like pump up the narration a bit for their shortcomings in that regard. And when they do occasionally say something that really does has some snap, crackle, and pop to it, you can really like highlight that. But otherwise, it's you're putting the shine on it. But yeah, when you're at the mercy of their actual voice for film or radio or podcasts, it's like you need them to be good talkers. And yeah, so it's like you got to be really judicious about who you're picking because they have to carry the water for the film.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think that's where you got to make the tough decisions of who do we include, who do we not include. I would love to try to like make a film about. Actually, we're working on a short film right now about an individual. It's a great story, but talking like isn't his strong suit. And so, but it's such a good story that we're like, how do we tell this story maybe without relying on a primary sit down interview with him? And so it brings up a whole nother host of creative challenges. But that doesn't mean the story isn't worth telling. It's just we got to get creative with how we do so.
Oh yeah, yeah, 100%. And what I liked too about this particular film is like, of course, it's like tied in with athletic brewing, but the product placement, if you will, and the branding of it isn't obnoxious and like in your face, like, oh, this is clearly a commercial for this particular brand, and it's very subtle just in just what they're wearing because they're ambassadors for and it's not like every scene has like a can of non-alcoholic beer in the background. There's like very little of that going on throughout the whole film, and I found that really it just it lent itself to a greater sense of confidence on the part of the brand and the filmmaking. I think that we don't have to hit the viewer in the face with this thing. Like, we're forefronting the story, not our product.
Yeah, I mean that's props to the athletic team. I mean that direction comes from them. I think that's a respectable and a bold way to go. I think the world of brand storytelling is so nebulous and complicated, and obviously there's some great brands out there that do it really well that I think people look to. But to do it well requires a lot of thought, and it requires, I think, an entire team, a whole C-suite, if you will, of people who see the value and see the long-term play. So it's definitely not a one and done or a one-off. I think people do that, but I think playing the long game is tricky. And so props to Athletic for, I mean, yeah, making it happen. Sure, we were the ones that were helping tell the story, but they were the ones that were like, hey, we want to tell a story in the first place. So it definitely would not have come to be without them.
When you're looking out there at the documentary landscape, like, what is it that you're seeing out there that you're inspired by, or just what's the lay of the land for you as a filmmaker that's exciting you about it, but also is like maybe problematic as well?
Oh man, um, that's a that's a deep question that I don't have all the answers to. It's a really interesting time, I feel like, to be a filmmaker. And I guess again I'm speaking from the perspective of like working in the kind of the commercial side of it, that I don't understand as much the narrative side or have much of a pulse on that. I feel like media is kind of like media at large, streaming, studios, Hollywood, like everything is just kind of up in the air. Like everything is unknown. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's opportunity, but there's also fear. And I think as much as for a long time, I never really thought that affected like the small teams like us. But I think I've been realizing like, no, actually, I think like those big tectonic changes, they do eventually trickle down to people like us, the filmmakers, that are, yeah, making branded stuff. And so I feel so there's like multiple levels. There's like the big level, like everything's changing at the top level. I also feel like the marketing, like the outdoor marketing industry is another kind of sub level. That's like a third level. Second level would be like marketing and like brand storytelling. Third level is like the outdoor industry specifically. And each of those three levels are all going through their own changes. They're all going through their own questioning and trying to uh, articulate the value and understand like what are we doing, like how are we marketing, like what is good marketing, and all of that's changing. And so it is an interesting time to be in. I feel like I think I see this. I hear about it. I talk to other filmmakers, like they all experience it. Like the last year has been a pretty bumpy year for a lot of people. Inconsistent work, like projects getting started and then being canceled. And I don't think it's the fault of them. I think it's just there's so much that's changing, and we're all trying to figure out like where do we fit into all of this. I think the thing that like gives me hope and like gives me encouragement is just like, I mean, it's never been a better time to like tell stories. There's never been a better time to distribute those stories. Sure, like distribution is complicated, and I don't understand, even a tenth of it, but it's like there's so much potential. There's almost too much opportunity. It's like there's too many things to pursue. If we just had like five things to pursue, it would be easier. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of opportunity out there. Also, if you can find it, if you can look for it.
Well, yeah, and I think nowadays with social media being what it is, and how people have a lot of agency to be their own storytellers, you see this a lot with athletes now, which I imagine is pretty frustrated for like sports documentarians who are like want to tell some rich stories, but like a bigger athlete, they have their own production companies now, so they control the message. They if they share anything, it's on their terms, and that's their prerogative. But at the same time, we kind of lose the messaging is a little bit cloudy because you're controlling the editorial, and it's like, and it's not in the hands of independent journalists or filmmakers or of that in that regard. I think it's all the more important these days for people like yourself who are like skilled in this to help tell those stories, who know the story beats and the mechanics of it, because everyone can do it means everyone can. and as a result, the fundamental skills aren't necessarily shared by everyone. So it's on people like yourself who can be like, you know what, no, this is how we're gonna really animate the story and find the heart of the things, and it's gonna have that much more power in your hands versus someone else who's just like putting a reel on Instagram.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a piece of the fragmentation of like everything that everyone's still trying to evaluate. We're kind of like, where's this gonna go?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think like, yeah, I mean, I think everyone is like more stories are being told every day, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think I say we, I think like the marketing industry, the outdoor industry, has devalued, not devalued. I think we've lost track of like what is a good story. I think like the stories that get
Mm.
told are, I don't know. Maybe I'm just jaded, but like they're kind of dry. They're kind of all the same. None of them are like, some of them are truly groundbreaking. Don't get me wrong, but many of them are just meh. Like they're not. As the audience, you don't get engrossed. You're not enthralled. There's no sense of like empathy for the character, and I think that's the biggest opportunity. Is like let's redefine like what is a good story, what counts, what doesn't. Sure, everyone's is important. It's great that everyone can share their own story, but for the stories that are really really good, like how can we set this one up for success? How can we get this in the hands of the right storyteller with the right distribution, with the right funding or the right client or brand or whomever to like make this thing happen? And I think you do see that, but they're just few and far between.
Yeah, when you ask that question, what is a good story? Like for you, what is a good story to you based on your taste?
I just love anything that emotionally connects me with the character. Like I want to feel for the character. I think the biggest thing is like I want to care for the character. And if I don't care about them, then I'm not interested. Like
Yeah.
and so I think that's kind of one of the litmus tests is like, is this story that you're telling, do you care? Does the audience care? And I think that part of that's the story itself of the character. Part of that's how the story is being told, all of the creative choices that you're making to tell that story. But I think that's the biggest thing. That's what I want to see, and that was one of the things that I kind of kept repeating to myself and our team throughout this documentary was like, we need to care about these characters. We need to care about how they cross the finish line, not because of like the physical achievement, but because of what this race means in the context of their life. And that was one of our own like internal kind of guiding lights towards telling this story. Is like, we need people to care.
Mm-hmm.
Crossing an Ironman finish line is awesome. Everyone has a story who does it, but like, let's make people care beyond just the physical. We want them to care about this individual as a person.
Yeah, and what really worked in your favor for this as well was the tension of the clock throughout, especially for like the race itself. Early on in the film, he's like in 90 Days to Lake Placid, so you're building to something. There's all an internal clock in that sense, but then in the race itself, and when you start planning like there's a cutoff for this, suddenly you're like, okay, someone's gonna be running up against this cutoff, and are they gonna make it or not? And it's so hard to procure tension in nonfiction because you can't just make up the tension. It has to evolve organically, as we already said. And so you're able to use the clock in this sense to really ratchet up the tension. And because we're so invested in them emotionally, you're like, oh man, like, are they going to make it? If they don't, how are they going to react? And it's like you're so bought in at that point that it's all the more heartbreaking when like they don't make it by a certain cutoff.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's just one of those things where we kind of got lucky with the race and the venue and how the race mechanics work. Yeah, you have 17 hours to finish the race. There's a couple cutoffs in between there that you also have to make. And yeah, if things aren't working in your favor, you don't make that cutoff, then you don't continue. You don't finish the race, and that's what they were all up against. That 17-hour mark essentially is what they were all trying to come in under, and so that naturally just kind of was our tension. That was as much as they all had their own personal conflicts throughout the race, like that was kind of the external antagonist, if you will.
Yeah, and what are some maybe some films that you revisit a lot or really inspire you to as models and Just things that really you're like, oh, I love this one. When I'm sitting down to make a film, I watch this to kind of remind me how it's done, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I don't watch a lot actually.
Hmm.
I should watch more. Every time I do watch a great documentary, I'm like, "Oh, this is amazing. I should do this more often." Um, there's a couple out there that come to mind. Free Solo is such a great film, and I feel like
Yeah, talk
it's
about tension. Yeah.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, I've mad respect for that project and those storytellers. What I think I really loved on Netflix, The Last Dance. If you've seen that,
I did, yeah. I love that too. I tried for my Prefontaine book that we talked about before to structure the book like The Last Dance,
Mm.
where they seesawed between the upper storyline of that final season uh, to the backstories of previous seasons. But I was very inspired by that structure. I couldn't quite pull it off with this book, but yeah. But likewise, I watched it several times, taking notes, be like, how are they doing this, so I can maybe steal that structure.
Right. And I think what I loved about that is like I feel like you got such a good sense for who the characters were. Like you really got to know their personalities and like what I love is a good documentary that within like the first 30 seconds or the minute you're like, "Oh, I care about this person. Like I like them as a person." And then you're like, "I'll sit through however many hours to like see where this journey takes me." But I love that. And so yeah, those are two that come to mind.
Speaking of that, in terms of the character, you want to almost be sold on them in the first 30 seconds. Like, how much debate was there with you and your team about who was going to basically bat lead off for you for Inches to Miles?
I think we all I think we all realized through the process that Lynn was kind of our main character. She was our A storyline, and then the other two were the B storyline, and not because they were any less, but just because of how the events unfolded
Yeah.
throughout the film. And so she also just I think because of my questioning in the interview process, like I really asked a bunch of questions that gave us responses that seemed to fit kind of the hook of the film, the first 30 60 seconds or whatever it is. And so it also just happened to work that like her dialogue worked for kind of that opening we were going for, and the other two, like their dialogue didn't fit as much, I think, because I just didn't ask as many questions that tried to prompt responses that would fit in that opening. So that was kind of the thought process, and that's how we ended up with, because Lynn is the first voice we hear in the film.
And when it comes to interviewing and interview prep, what is the nature of your research, and how would you characterize your style of interviewing to evoke the best things on film?
What is my style? I don't know. Just have a conversation,
Hmm.
ask questions, make sure I shut up.
Shutting up's a big one. I can't advocate for that enough. Like, oftentimes I just let silence do some work.
Yeah,
And as uncomfortable as that is, you can always edit that stuff out. But it's like, if you give them enough silence, oftentimes they'll start to fill it, and that's usually the best stuff.
100%. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think going into this, we kind of knew all the beats we needed to hit. So I had a list for each of the characters. I had a list of here's a story beats we need to touch on. And so kind of the first step of the interview was, okay, let's go through the past 10 years of your life. Let's talk about it. Let's make sure we cover these interesting moments. Let's really get into like, how did these moments feel? What did they look like? Kind of paint us a picture, like a lot of those types of questions. And then we started to talk more generally. We're like, okay, let's talk about your childhood. Let's talk about sports and athletics. Like, what did that mean to you growing up? Um, and we went through that kind of category. So I broke it up into a bunch of categories. And so we if you look at my prep documents, like it's all broken up into category and then a bunch of questions off of that. My biggest, I love to just listen and see what
Mm-hmm.
they're saying, hear what they're saying. You can do all the prep, you can come up with all the greatest questions you can come up with, but I feel like at the end of the day, you just have to listen and see what they say, and pull on those threads as they bring something up, because you never know where that takes you. And so that's the biggest thing, I think, is I just try to um, listen, be quiet, and just let them tell the story.
Yeah, and I think it's all the more complicated, for you and your tool set, because you might only have one big sit down, For me, it's like if I'm like, oh, I forgot to ask that question, I could usually just call someone up. Like, I forgot to ask you this, or can I follow up? But with you, if you were to do such a thing, it's like, got to bring the crew down, got to set everything up and set everyone down, mic everybody up. And it's this whole production.
Not
So
to
you
mention
need to
fly
like,
around the country.
yeah. So you got to be like really on your shit when you have them for a sit down. I imagine there's a lot of pressure involved there to make sure you get everything that at least the main beats down, because if you don't, it's like you can't really get it again in the way that you initially wanted.
Yeah, I mean, it is the backbone of the film.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, I don't know, prepare well.
Yeah, no substitute for that.
I mean,
For
and if
sure.
you have the budget, if you have the time, like if you can do pickup interviews, great. Those, I mean, I've certainly used those when the subject is closer and we don't have to travel halfway around the country to go see them. But that's not always an option. So you just got to really, really plan it out.
Very nice. Well, Cole, as I bring these conversations down for a landing, I always love asking the guests for a recommendation of some kind. It's just like anything you're excited about to share with the listeners. So, what might you recommend for them? Be it a brand of coffee or a cool a cool pair of socks that you're excited about.
Ooh, let me give that some thought. I feel like your day is so much better if you go to work, if you can go to work, like wearing a pair of sandals. Like
Okay.
I'm wearing a pair of flip flops right now, and every day that I get to wear flip flops rather than like put on a real shoe, I just feel like my day is way better. And so I don't know if there's like something about the fresh air hitting your feet that inspires creativity or what, but if you can, I'd wear sandals more often.
I like that. I like the kind of the freedom of near barefoot, tactile feel of the ground. I like that. A lot of people, no shade on them, they always recommend books, even though I say it doesn't have to be a book. And so I like this idea that sandals and a little freedom with the toes. I like that, Cole.
If you want a book recommendation, I don't know, your audience probably really hates what I'm about to say, but I love a good Clive Cussler book.
Okay.
I've just finished one this morning, and yeah, sometimes I just want to read about some ridiculous fiction story.
Well, that's great. Be it short stories or suspense or thrillers, like they're so valuable to read, even in nonfiction, because you're like, okay, like who are the people I can follow, or what are the questions I can ask of the people that might create the same degree of tension in scene setting and dialogue. So you can always, there's so much to learn from fiction that translates over to nonfiction, without a doubt.
Yeah, 100%.
Awesome. Well, Cole, this was so great. The film's incredible. I'm so glad we got to talk some shop about the mechanics, about how you went about making the film, and talking about some of the guts of it. So, just thanks for coming on the show and making the time.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it, and appreciate that you've got a platform dedicated to talking about this stuff.
Oh, I got the yawn up. I finally got the yawn up. Oh, man. What a journey. This was cool. Yes. Thanks to Cole, and thanks to you for listening. Remember, you can download and subscribe to this show wherever you get your podcasts, and consider sharing it and or adding the Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter to your newsstand at BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey, been doing the newsletter for a long time, almost as long as the podcast, or maybe about as long. I think I started newslettering and podcasting in 2012, 2013. So there you go. All right. So about that 3-star written review, here's what I love about it. It illustrates, that I, for one, I'm on the right path, because you can't appeal to everybody. If you're appealing to everybody, you're more than likely a very vanilla personality, and something that maybe AI could churn out. I wholly disagree with this anonymous reviewer's take. Sure, I cuss and I talk like a bro at times, but that's also just me signaling that I'm not a pretentious academic dickwad. I hate those people in literature. I'm not seeking tenure, and I hate how people in the kind of academic circles, I hate how sometimes, I don't know, I have felt talked down to. That's just it's something I've dealt with, and I don't like it. And I like to signal that that I can be in the literature circles and not sound like a jerk. Or like that other guy in Finding Forrester, if you've seen the movie. And when you can ruffle a few feathers or cut against expectations, that's a good thing. If people don't like you, you can say, that's great. I'm not for you. And that's okay. I can recommend other podcasts or books or writers. You get it. Not everyone who samples you is going to like you. Yeah, that's hard. As soft people, we tend to internalize criticism, especially when we're largely incapable of defending ourselves against those critics. This is also why you should never read your reviews ever. But I like to read the podcast ones because I believe it encourages more. More reviews helps validate the enterprise. And some unflattering ones signals that the show might not be for everyone. And I'm off-putting to some. But others kind of dig my POV when it comes to this shit, and that's cool. If people like us do things like this, as Seth Godin would say. On the rare times I've ever been asked for advice, one thing I always say is to double down on your weirdness. Whatever makes you weird, that is the thing you got to double down on. Interviews are a dime a dozen. Podcast interviews are a dime a dozen. Eventually, people come back to your show. For the guests, sure. But they also come to see how the central person there, being the host, metabolizes the material and conducts a conversation based on their taste. We already have, a fill in the blank, whoever your favorite podcasters are. What we need is, let's just say, you having conversations filtered through your taste and your respect for the guests and your audience. I'll admit, though, when I read that review, it deeply upset me for a few days. I respected it from the moment I read it. But clearly he, and trust me, only he's, say D-bag, is new to the party. Probably as a result of long form packing up their mics and going home. Him being a new listener, that probably why it came as a shock. You can always fast forward through the intros, and I'm sure many people do. I make a point of editing myself down in post, in the conversations especially, and put these parting shots at the end of the show so they don't trespass on the guest and your experience with them and the wisdom and insights that they can impart on your journey. So this little parting shot is your goodie bag. Take it or leave it. Many leave it. So stay wild, CNFers. And if you can't do, interview. See ya.